The Amazing Spider-Man movies are seen by a lot of people to merely be a stopgap in between two better Spider-Man franchises. However, they did have their fans, myself included, and evidently Sony were a part of that group too. While the series began as Spider-Man's answer to The Dark Knight, TASM 2 went through a noticeable tone shift that was more in line with what people expected out of the MCU movies, and this was done purposefully, as Sony was ambitiously planning a large slate of sequels, prequels, and spin-offs that would have formed a rival cinematic universe for the MCU, and their first real start would have been with The Amazing Spider-Man 3. So, what if The Amazing Spider-Man 3 wasn't cancelled? Following the release of The Avengers in 2012, Sony, who not long afterwards would release The Amazing Spider-Man, decided to change their plans for the Spider-Man saga. Originally, the TASM movies were conceived as dark and gritty movies that would take Peter Parker's character to bleaker places than the Sam Raimi movies could have ever dreamed of. However, after The Avengers, Sony decided that they wanted to change all their plans for their most profitable character and make a cinematic universe to rival the MCU, one which would have been built up by The Amazing Spider-Man 2 and fully realized in The Amazing Spider-Man 3. Alex Kurtzman, Jeff Pinkner, and Roberto Orci, who had all previously worked on TASM 2, would have returned to write TASM 3. Mark Webb also would have returned to the director's chair, but apparently this would have been the last time Webb directed one of the TASM movies, though he would have stayed on as producer and creative consultant for future movies. Andrew Garfield, on the other hand, might not have actually been in this movie at all. You see, Sony at one point were planning to do an Amazing Spider-Man prequel movie called The Amazing Spider-Man Kraven, which would have been released before The Amazing Spider-Man 3 and Ben Garfield's third film. And the reason this is important is because apparently Sony were actually planning to drop Andrew Garfield following his third appearance, due to some apparent clashes he was having with Amy Pascal over the future of the franchise, as well as no showing a gala where they were going to promote The Amazing Spider-Man 3, since they were contractually obligated to include Garfield in at least one more Spider-Man movie. Then if the prequel was actually made first, then Garfield probably wouldn't have been in The Amazing Spider-Man 3 at all. Now, for the movie's villains, we'd see a huge amount of different characters, including Dane DeHaan's Harry Osborn and Paul Giamatti's Rhino. However, we would have also seen appearances from Doc Ock, possibly played by Christoph Waltz, the Vulture, possibly played by Matthew McConaughey, Kraven the Hunter, possibly played by Shane West, Scorpia, possibly played by Emily Blunt, and Mysterio, possibly played by Zachary Quinto. Supposedly as well, the team would have been led by Chris Cooper's Norman Osborn, who would remain secretly alive as a head in a jar. No, I'm not kidding. This movie, of course, also would have seen the return of Sally Field as Aunt May, and seen the debut of Shailene Woodley as Mary Jane Watson, who was supposed to be in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, but was cut out due to time constraints. Now, Felicia Hardy was supposed to return, debut as Black Cat, and continue her planned romance with Harry Osborn. However, from the looks of things, Felicity Jones was not planned to return to the series due to commitments to Star Wars Rogue One, and would have seemingly been replaced, although I've also heard reports that say that she was incredibly eager to play the role of Black Cat properly in a future movie, so I honestly don't know who to believe, so take that with a grain of salt. Now, other characters we might have seen in this movie include Gwen Stacy's cousin, Jill Stacy, who may have been played by Emma Watson, Ned Leeds, played by Justin Chatwin, Eddie Brock, played by either Channing Tatum or Finn Wittrock, Betty Brant, played by either Zooey Deschanel or Olivia Wilde, and J. Jonah Jameson, played, of course, by J.K. Simmons. The plot of this movie would involve Peter still not fully recovered from the death of Gwen Stacy and the betrayal of his best friend Harry Osborn. He's going through the motions as Spider-Man, and he has to deal with new recurring threats on a fairly regular basis. He's encouraged by his Aunt May to begin attending grief counseling sessions, where he would meet Mary Jane. They would have romantic tension, but Peter would be terrified of getting close to her because of his fear of putting her in harm's way like he did with Gwen. Peter would also begin attending college, where he would befriend fellow classmate Ned Leeds, who would become his new best friend. He'd also continue his job as a photographer at the Daily Bugle, where we'd meet J. Jonah Jameson, as well as rival photographer and eventual unlikely friend Eddie Brock. Peter would get into a fight with a collection of villains known as the Sinister Six inside of Oscorp Tower, with one of the members being Harry, who was broken out of prison by the Gentleman. It would be through Peter's interactions with the Gentleman and the still-alive Norman Osborn that he'd learn more about his parents' past, and what exactly happened to them and why. A possible major plotline for this movie also would have seen Peter become bonded with the Venom symbiote, which is a secret project that was worked on by Oscorp that Norman Osborn secretly wanted Peter to bond with all along. The symbiote brings out the worst in Peter, who's was already not doing very well, and would show Peter as most aggressive and most vulnerable. A possible plotline would have seen Peter using his own blood to bring Gwen Stacy back from the dead. His blood, combined with the symbiote, would cause Gwen to return as Carnage, and force Spider-Man and the Sinister Six to team up and take out a greater threat, and force Peter to personally confront the physical manifestation of his mistakes. The ending might have featured Gwen dying all over again, a la Jean Grey in X-Men The Last Stand. However, the Carnage symbiote would remain alive and well, and bond with Cletus Cassidy, setting him up to be the main villain of a future movie. Ultimately, despite TASM 2 not receiving the warmest reception and not grossing as much as Sony wanted it to, The Amazing Spider-Man 3 was seemingly still going ahead, with casting calls expected to take place in January of 2015, with an estimated release of 2016 or 17. However, this plan was ultimately nixed in the end, and the TASM universe as a whole was entirely cancelled. And so that is what The Amazing Spider-Man 3 would have entailed. So now, do I think it would have been a good movie? Yes and no. Like, there are definitely plot points about this movie I think are good. I like the idea of Peter going to grief counseling and trying to move on from Gwen. And I like the idea of Mary Jane being his new love interest because, you know, I mean, Mary Jane is his most iconic love interest, and that's usually how it goes in the comics. Usually Gwen is his first love interest who dies, and then Mary Jane is, like, his second love interest. That's normally how it goes. So I think it would make sense for Mary Jane to be his new love interest, and this might be an unpopular opinion, but I'm kind of glad they cut her out of TASM 2, because that movie already had a lot going on, and I think that if she was in that movie, it would have made it even more obvious that Gwen was going to die. So I am glad that they were going to save her for this movie. I think Shailene Woodley would have actually been a really good Mary Jane. She's a very talented actress, and she's really able to do a bunch of range. She can do quirky, she can do outsider, you know, she can do, you know, dramatic and sad, she can do romantic, she can do it all. And honestly, I just think that Mary Jane is a character that would suit her really well. Dane DeHaan as Green Goblin was not very good, I'm sorry to say. He wasn't the worst. He could have given a worse performance, but I didn't think he was that good either. But maybe he could have gotten better, because he's not a bad actor. I've seen him in other things where he's actually pretty good. It's just this movie, The Amazing Spider-Man 2, that is, was not really suited to his abilities, I don't think. I think that the script really let him down, and he could have been a much better Harry Osborn with better direction. So maybe his performance in TASM 3 would have learned from the mistakes of TASM 2. Maybe his performance in this movie would have been a whole lot better. And honestly, I would have loved to see this growing, you know, feud between Peter and Harry, because, you know, they really took the entire Raimi trilogy to build this rivalry up between them. And it would be interesting to see these former friends turned rivals, you know? Like, because in this one, it's not, you know, Peter killing Norman like it was in the Raimis. It's, you know, it's Harry killing, you know, Gwen. And that would have been really interesting to see them, you know, kind of having to work together to actually take Gwen out when she becomes Carnage, if that's a storyline they were going to do, because I don't know if that's exactly what they're going to do. I mean, the Sinister Six as a whole might have been enough for the main villains. I don't think they needed to do Carnage, but it would have been interesting. It would have been really interesting to see, you know, this desperate Peter, like so desperate to reclaim what he's lost, that he makes a horrible mistake, and he brings Gwen back to life, but at what cost? And he ends up having to put down his own creation. You know, I just think that would have been a really interesting story to see, especially if he was going to have to work with, you know, Harry, who killed her in the first place. That would have been really interesting. I think introducing the symbiote in a movie like this would have been a really interesting idea, because Peter was broken at the end of The Amazing Spider-Man 2. He quit being Spider-Man for 5 months and nearly didn't come back. And when he came back, you could tell he didn't have the same fire. So it would have been really interesting to see this emotionally broken and vulnerable Peter bonding with the symbiote that's known for bringing out the worst in whoever wears it. That would have just been a really, really good story. Probably even better, possibly, than the one they did with Maguire. And I know the one with Maguire wasn't that good, but I do think this one could have been better, because, say what you will, I don't think they should have killed Gwen in TASM 2, but I do think that they did a good job with it. I mean, yeah, the Green Goblin killing her, it was a bit rushed, but the actual death itself was really emotional, and Andrew Garfield really, really sold how tragic it was. It was really well done. And I would have loved to see more of that. I think Andrew Garfield probably would have given his best Spider-Man performance in this movie. I really wish that we could have seen that for that reason. And as far as the Sinister Six goes, I've always had mixed ideas about all these Sinister Six plans they had, because I get why they wanted to do it, but, like, I just think it's too much. Like, I think they had too many characters lined up for this movie. You know, apart from just, like, the villains, you know, they're gonna introduce Mary Jane, and Jill Stacy, and Ned Leeds, and J. Jonah Jameson, and Eddie Brock, and Betty Brant. It's like, ugh, so many new characters, you know? And then you got, like, 6 or 7 villains, and it's just like, geez, man. So I just think this movie sounds overstuffed. It sounds like they didn't learn anything from The Amazing Spider-Man 2. This movie could have possibly been worse than The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I'm sure a ton of stuff would have been cut out. I could imagine Ned Leeds being cut out, the entire college storyline being dropped. I don't think they would drop the Daily Bugle because a lot of people were very apprehensive about not including the Bugle, really, in the first 2. A lot of people were pissed off that J. Jonah was not in the Amazing Spider-Man movies. So I do think they would have had to finally include them in this one. So I do think, unfortunately, Ned Leeds would have had to be cut, and that might have been for the best, because, no offense to Justin Chatwin, but from what I've seen of him, he's not that good, I'm sorry to say. Then again, I have only seen his earlier stuff. Like, I've seen Dragon Ball Evolution, and he was really bad in that. I haven't seen his other stuff. I don't know if he's gotten better since then, but as far as I know, if you ask me, it sounds like he probably would have given a really bad performance in this. But maybe the material would have been different. Maybe he's gotten to be a better actor since then. I don't know. I'm not going to pretend to know something I don't. So let me know in the comments down below if you think that he would have been good as Ned Leeds or not. So yeah, overall, there's a lot of ideas about this I like and don't like. I would have loved to see more of Peter and Harry's growing feud and them having to work together. I think the idea of bringing Gwen back as Carnage would have been really cool. The symbiote bonding with this vulnerable Peter would have been great. Shailene Woodley as Mary Jane sounds really good. You know, there's a lot of good ideas. Bringing back the Daily Bugle and J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson. These are all really good ideas, but it sounds like too much for one movie, and Sony never really did learn that lesson, unfortunately. It just has too many characters, too many plot lines, and I have a feeling that they would just spend this entire movie setting up more movies instead of trying to make this as good as it could be. I think really how good this movie would be would rely on the performances, and I do think Andrew Garfield and Shailene Woodley and Sally Field all would have been really good. The rest of them might have been hit or miss. There's a lot of good talent here. Like, I read off all those names. I don't know if they would have made the final cut, because that's a lot of, you know, star power. They might not have been able to afford all that star power. But, you know, even if you get all that star power, it doesn't mean a good movie. Like, look at the Expendables movies. None of them are exactly Oscar-worthy. You know, they got a bunch of, you know, talented actors in one movie. It doesn't mean that it's going to be a really good movie. You know, there is such a thing as too much of a good thing. You know what I mean? And seeing as, like, it seems like, you know, 4 out of 6 of the Sinister Six were going to debut in this movie, it just sounds like too damn much, in my opinion. Like, honestly, if it were up to me, I would have, like, built up the Sinister Six over, like, 6 movies. Like, 1 Sinister Six member in each movie, or, like, 2 to 1 movie. Like, just not the way they were doing it. Like, they were doing it way too fast. I think they got way too ambitious, and they knew it. That's why when The Amazing Spider-Man 2 failed, you know, they took a look at all their plans, and they realized that something had to change. And, you know, I give Sony credit for realizing that change was needed when it was. But despite that, I still would have liked to see this. Like, if there was a way we could have gotten this and the Tom Holland stuff, I would have taken it. I honestly do think that it would have been tidier to have a trilogy, at least, of Amazing Spider-Man movies. And I really would have liked to see Andrew Garfield come back. That is, if he did come back, because as I said, he might not have. He might not have come back for this movie. And therefore, it would have been interesting to see if, like, the new Spider-Man actor could carry over the emotional, you know, weight that Andrew Garfield brought to the role in TASM 2. Like, whether or not he would have been able to convince us that he was still the same Peter that was grieving the loss of Gwen. That would have been really interesting to see. So far, Sony has done a really good job casting their Spider-Mans, or Spider-Men, I should say. So I have no doubt that if they replaced Garfield, they probably would have replaced him with somebody good. So, you know, this movie just sounds really interesting. There's some bad ideas, like the Sinister Six is too much. Norman Osborn being a talking head, literally, just sounds like a kind of a stupid idea, I'm not gonna lie. And yeah, there's too much going on in this plan, and I'm sure some of it might have been cut, but, you know, who knows? But this movie does sound like it would have had a lot of good stuff, at least. So maybe it would have been at least better than TASM 2, but not as good as TASM 1. Who knows? Let me know in the comments down below. Would you have liked to see The Amazing Spider-Man 3? And if so, are there aspects of it that you like and don't like? like? I'd love to hear all about that in the comments down below. Also, give me more what if recommendations about the Amazing Spider-Man, regular Spider-Man, Marvel, or anything else you can think of. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share it with all of your friends and all your various social media platforms. And I'll see all of you in the next video.